Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Bird. I'm a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Christian Bible. By that, I mean the two primary testaments for Christians, the Old and New Testaments, or as I like to call them, the Hebrew Bible and the Newer Testament. So this video is part of a series that I have on my YouTube channel called Does the Bible Tell You So? And in that series, I have kind of a subset of videos looking at each of the chapters in my book called Marriage in the Bible. What do the texts say? So the first 4 chapters there are talking about the passages people use to talk about biblical marriage. The second set of texts is looking at the ways marriages show up, what kinds of ways people actually embody marriages in the two testaments. And then the last section is called That Which Remains, and this is a chapter in that section. Some of the ways that passages that might not seem like they're directly related to marriage, but actually do have an impact on the way people think about marriage. Let's talk about some of that. So chapter 9 is what I'm talking about today, and that is titled, What Are They Modeling? Okay, so I'm going to read parts of this chapter and then kind of summarize parts, but reading the parts that I think are really helpful or set the stage nicely, if you will. So this is from the introduction to chapter 9, What Are They Modeling? So there are 3 topics, in a sense, or 3 groups of ideas and texts that this chapter addresses. First, what is the marriage relationship itself used to convey in biblical texts? So we'll talk about that in a second. Second, what is being communicated through commands to married or paired up people? And third, what kinds of messages have faith communities been perpetuating about sex or marriage using various biblical passages that seemingly involve marriage? So, though these topics overlap quite a bit, I hope you'll work with me in my attempt to discuss these 3 separately for the sake of seeing the many layers that are at work here. So, see what you discover if you consider the power dynamics that are involved. Take seriously that these texts have a materiality to them, which is the ideals in them become realized in communities and relationships, usually unconsciously. So that's the introduction. So the first part, what is the marriage relationship itself used to convey in biblical texts? And the part I talk about in this section is predominantly what we see happening in the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. So in the prophetic content, in these prophetic pronouncements, the prophets themselves stand in as if they are a voice piece or a mouthpiece for God. And so what they say comes out of their mouth as if it is God speaking to the people. And what we see in multiple, not just 1 or 2, but in multiple prophets, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and I think those are the most powerful examples, I should say. What we see them doing is talking to the people in charge, right, the men, and they're essentially trying to shame the leadership back into covenantal kinds of relationships with God, meaning taking care of people instead of exploiting them, right, in kind of short term there. And so it's a really interesting thing that we see the prophets essentially shaming these men by effeminizing them, by calling them the bride of God, right? So you are Yahweh's bride, over and over and over. And I actually had a bit of an exchange with a Hebrew Bible scholar, very highly respected scholar, and he was saying in a couple of his articles, he was talking about, yeah, that's precisely what's happening here. These men are being shamed. They're being called a woman, and there's no better way to shame men, especially in an ancient context, than by calling them a woman. So there is that. That's a really important part of ancient worldviews about men and women, and to a certain extent, that's still alive and well in some pockets, right? In some parts of our culture. So there's that. But what's also disturbing in that moment of, the prophets speaking to the people, is that in at least the 4 that I mentioned, God is talking to them and is calling them names, especially sexualized names, and is belittling them, yelling at them, threatens to be abusive and even sexually so. Like, there are some really intense passages in Hosea, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, right? And Isaiah, even. I'd forgotten it was in Isaiah too. So there's really intense language being used. And so the prophet is modeling what they think God is saying to them to get people back in line, right? But as they do that, they're using a hetero relationship, God as the husband, the people as the wife in our terms, and all kinds of really strong language is being used. It's actually quite unsettling for me every time I have to engage it. Let me read from another part, from the kind of the wrap up near the end of that section of the chapter. Please hold on to each of these points as you reflect on how marriage is talked about in the Bible and in the examples being modeled for people of faith. No wonder so many people today have a hard time seeing such language, manipulation, and treatment as abusive, especially when it is followed by claims of everlasting love, which happens in all of those cases. If people are finding ways to ignore or excuse this dynamic with their God, not only can it be tolerated in other parts of their lives as well, but that practice excusing the behavior in the most important being in their lives numbs them to seeing the extent of the issue in relationships around them. I hope you can track with what I'm getting at there. If you can say that, well, God can, call us terrible names because God ultimately loves us, then think about if you can tolerate that and think about yourself as being in needing to love that being. Think about how that then plays out in human relationships and how it sets you up not to see it as being as bad as it is. The next paragraph is really important too, so let me read that. I would like you to take a step back from all of this and consider what these texts show us. What these texts show me is that people conditioned to think that they do get to control a woman and her comings and goings will then also think that they can be righteously angry when she behaves in ways contrary to their will. I think about the patriarchal soup that these texts came out of and that they aid in perpetuating. I think of the way that same entitlement mixes with relational dysfunction and control. I think of the fact that these texts show us what happens when the person with the purse strings begins to withhold, in any form, from the other partner. I think about the gradual progression from belittling a partner with names, sexualized or otherwise, to eventual physical and sexual abuse. I think about how common these issues still are today. So there's a lot going on in the prophetic content when they are talking to the people using this. The other thing before I move on to the next section that I want to highlight is that the husband-wife dynamic, as it's translated usually as husband-wife, even though it's still just man and woman in the Hebrew, that relationship, the man-woman relationship, is never used in a positive way. It only comes up when they're trying to shame people or to control people's behavior. That is kind of terrifying, right? Okay, so the second section, what's being communicated through commands to paired up people. So let me read a part here that says it nicely, what it is I'm trying to get you to think about. When a person reads through the letters in the Newer Testament, they will find that most of the content is offered in a general way to the whole community. And this is really important because there are debates about when in Paul's letters when he says to the brothers or to the men? Like, does he mean just the men, or does he mean brothers and sisters? And so some translations tease that out, and some just, anyway. But most of his comments are to people in general, right? But you will also find a handful of passages that are directed to certain groups of people, specifically to women and men, though usually the English translations say husbands and wives, but it's just women and men in the Greek, enslaved peoples and children. Okay, so those are all household roles, right? So those latter two categories, enslaved peoples and children, do matter, but I'm not going to focus on that. I don't focus on that in this chapter. For this context, I would like to invite you to sit with and process the impact that it has had on people to have the only commands given to them directly, like as a subgroup of people and not just as the whole community, the only commands given to them directly couched in terms of being in a paired up relationship. And that relationship is always discussed as being male-female. Okay, there's a lot going on just in that, right? Right? I mean, you're a widow because your husband has died, right? You're a virgin because we call you a virgin because of your lack of a relationship with having been penetrated by a man. Like, all of these labels, right? It's really kind of overwhelming when you sit down and think about it, right? So I think just on that level, what does it do to people that the only time they're kind of given direct commands, right? Like, we love each other in this community, but men do this, women do this. And it's always in a context where you're assuming that these people are paired up. Like, doesn't that send a message that being paired up is kind of important in these communities? Yeah, it's because they were meeting in households and household code ideas are being reintroduced or introduced to these communities for the first time, for lots of reasons I talk about elsewhere. Like, there's some really powerful, subconsciously impacting people kinds of messages going on there, right? To restate what I just said, because I think it's kind of helpful to hear it more than once, I'm trying to invite you to think about why the only directives specifically to women or men are presented in their paired up relationships, and what unintentional fallout that has had. And I do think it's unintentional, right? Is it that the ancient writers did not really care about single people? Probably not, right? Perhaps it was just more convenient to use the paired up relationships that they knew were represented in the weekly meetings, given that they did happen in household spaces. Using the household relationships as a framework for church directives was clever. It also leaves out, at least in today's terms, a decent portion of the population and sends the signal that the married relationship was the only one that mattered in church. Food for thought. Let me see if I can just boil this down because this video is getting long. Paul has a particular stance on sex and marriage that is absolutely contrary to what we see Jesus talking about. Okay, Jesus is fine, seems fine with marriage, right? Jesus also talks about marriage and divorce through the terms of the reason you don't divorce is because when you have sex, that's a way that a man claims a woman's body. Like, he's fully informed by what we see attributed to Jesus is fully informed by Hebrew Bible standards about women as property, like it or not, right? So Jesus doesn't seem to be down on marriage. He seems okay with it. In fact, he's okay with levirate marriage. When a situation comes up and is presented to him in one of the Gospels, like, he's not depicted as saying, maybe we should reconsider that practice. Like, he seems okay with the practice of levirate marriage. Paul, on the other hand, is basically saying, don't get married. In fact, some of his language in 1 Corinthians 7 sounds like he is anti-marriage and also thinks that people should abstain from sex. it sets this, he sets the scene quite nicely for Augustine, who comes a couple hundred years later, who himself actually thinks that sex is sinful in and of itself, right? So we have Paul saying, yeah, it's better to abstain entirely. Jesus, who's fine with marriage. Just that in and of itself is worth sitting with and thinking about, isn't it? But then we also have the book Song of Songs. And what happens in the book is that there are lovers talking about each other and reflecting on enjoying their trysts in the fields and in the wooded spaces, and they know each other's bodies, and there's no shame here. There's just delight in the sensuality. And isn't that a lovely, refreshing change? But a quick engagement with the Song of Songs is in order. At least half of his content is spoken from a female's perspective, a welcome change for the canon overall. I have found that teenagers of any gender can see it fairly easily as the soft erotica that it is, even if the comparisons and pet names being used are from a different context than their own. Nevertheless, the men doing the interpretation and translation of this book over the centuries regularly chose to turn it into a metaphor of God with the people of Israel or Christ with the church. And that is a really stunning thing to encounter now that I, don't see it that way anymore, but I used to see it that way or think about it that way. It's pretty stunning to have someone, an adult, say to you in an online discussion that these opening lines, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is perfume poured out. No wonder the maidens love you. To have someone say that is God talking to his bride Israel, or that is a follower of Christ talking to Christ. Like, why are we so uncomfortable just talking about sensuality and sexuality? Like, what is going on here, people? So I talk about that. And one or two other passages in terms of, it's pretty clear that we've got some sexual reference, some euphemisms going on here within the book Song of Songs. So what does it tell you, right? That the people who developed these faith communities were more comfortable talking about God and the people in a sexualized way than they were just talking about sex between two people. What does that tell you? Like, these traditions have inherited some issues around bodies and sex, right? So let me read one of the closing paragraphs to the chapter. What I care about as a biblical scholar is what people are doing with what they find in the Bible. I've said that several times, haven't I? How honest are people being about what is found in these pages? How much mental gymnastics are they undertaking in order to make something okay, or to ignore, this is important, the non-judgment of sex outside of marriage passages, ignoring that, right? Which passages do people cling to for dear life, and which are they conveniently unaware of? I care about people being hurt or limited by trying to uphold genuinely biblical standards. It matters to me that this collection of scriptures contains such harmful content for people to emulate. Yet so many people of faith either do not know about this side of their scriptures, or if they do, they have found a way to accommodate it. As with problems or issues in life, the place to start is to acknowledge what is going on, it seems to me. As with other chapters in this book, what I sought to encourage in this chapter is an important step for anyone interested in this larger conversation, whether conservative Jew or Christian or non-religious activist for marriage equality. We all need to be more cognizant of how these scriptures do impact people and communities first, before we can do any work toward addressing or perhaps changing the scripts these sacred writings have had a hand in creating. Thanks. You can find this book online on Amazon or the publisher, which is Rowman and Littlefield, and I have the audio version available of the book as well.